Kings Island is a fantastic park in Mason, Ohio, just north of Cincinnati, that many coaster enthusiasts claim to be one of the greatest parks in the country. I had the pleasure of visiting this park for the first time in August of 2020, just after Orion opened, and I went again this June to ride all of their fantastic coasters again, so I think I got a pretty good feel for most of their 14 different roller coasters. The park's top 3 are especially impressive, all of which easily make my top 7 coasters I have ever ridden. So let's get right into the rankings. At number 14 is no surprise in the slightest, it's the park's E&F Myler Kiddie Coaster Great Pumpkin Coaster. This is the only coaster that I actually haven't ridden at the park, but the layout is pretty basic and similar to other coasters I've ridden, so it makes sense to put it at this spot. It is a solid kiddie coaster though, and I'm sure it's better than others like at Howler at Holiday World, for example, which is very janky, especially for a kiddie coaster. At number 13 is another coaster in the park's kiddie section, Flying Ace Aerial Chase. This coaster is a standard Vekoma family suspended coaster, and it's honestly pretty shaky, especially in the second half. The restraints aren't great either, and it's easily a one-and-done credit for me at the park. Vekoma has gotten a lot better in recent years, however, and their more recent family coasters like Dragonflyer at Dollywood are a vast improvement to these early models built in the early 2000s. At number 12 is the park's biggest kiddie coaster, Woodstock Express, which is also one of the park's 4 different wooden coasters. This PTC coaster has some solid airtime pops on the first couple of drops, and the ride has buzz bars, so it's actually a pretty enjoyable ride for its size. This ride opened with the park in 1972 and has a few different rides and names throughout the years, such as Beastie, for the longest amount of time. At number 11 is the park's Vekoma Inverted Boomerang in Vertigo, which opened in 1999, originally as Face Off, themed to the movie by Paramount. This ride is pretty janky, especially with its bulky over-the-shoulder restraints, making the ride almost impossible to experience without at least a little headbanging. I do slightly prefer this model to the normal Boomerang model, though, but it still isn't great and usually has a pretty long line due to how it always has one train running. At number 10 is the park's Aero Mine Train Adventure Express, which opened in 1991. This mine train is pretty fun. It starts off with a small coaster section before the first lift hill, as well as having plenty of theming throughout the layout, even having some animatronics during the ride's final lift hill. The ride is still a little janky, but it's not as bad as some older mine train models, such as River King Mine Train at Six Flags St. Louis. I do, however, prefer River King Mine Train due to having a better finale, with Adventure Express just ending with a lift hill into the station, which is a little anticlimactic. At number 9 is the park's Premier Rides Family Launch Coaster, Backlot Stunt Coaster, which originally opened as Italian Job Stunt Track in 2005. This ride has some really fun launches, and the initial helix is actually really intense to start the ride. The coaster also has plenty of theming, including a helicopter shooting at you, flame effects, and even a pretty decent indoor section, which is really fun. The ride also has some decent airtime moments, especially during the final drop underneath the bridge that is in the queue line. This ride is a really solid family ride and easily the best family coaster in the park, and one of my favorites I have ridden only below Hagrid's and Fire Chaser Express. At number 8 is the park's Aero Suspended Coaster, the Bat, which originally opened as Top Gun in 1993. This coaster is really fun and intense with its unique swinging feature, and is also really smooth too. The ride is extremely short, however, with only about 30 seconds of prime ride time, but it does a lot in those 30 seconds. The ride is also in a very secluded setting and makes for some pretty good visuals when you ride the attraction. The current name also pays tribute to the original suspended coaster at the park, also called the Bat, that only operated at the park for a few years before it was torn down. At number 7 is the park's Premier Rides indoor launch coaster, Flight of Fear, that opened in 1996. This ride has some of the best theming in the park during its queue and during the ride, with some nice lighting effects and music. The launch itself isn't anything too crazy, but is a good first kick and sends you to some pretty intense inversions right at the beginning of the ride. The ride is a little on the rougher side, but it's not too bad with the lap bars, and the ride has a great ride duration that I was pleasantly surprised with. The ride easily gets some of the longest lines in the park, however, due to its poor capacity, so I would suggest trying to hit this up early in the day. At number 6 is the park's PTC Racing wooden coaster, Racer, which opened with the park in 1972. This ride has been vastly improved upon over the past couple of off-seasons by some much-needed retracking by the Gravity Group, making this ride much more enjoyable than it has been in previous years. The park almost always makes sure to dual the two sides, and it has some pretty solid airtime throughout the whole ride. It is a little on the short side as a pretty basic layout, but it's still a really fun ride that you should definitely check out each time at Kings Island. It also has one of the higher capacities in the park, so it usually doesn't have too long of a wait either. At number 5 is the park's massive in-house wooden coaster, the Beast, which is still the longest wooden coaster in the world and opened in 1979. The ride has also gotten some retracking in recent years, making it an even smoother ride experience. The ride doesn't have a ton in the airtime department, but it has a fantastic lateral fill helix finale at the end, which is easily my favorite part of the ride, and it really does feel long, especially with its two very long and drawn-out lift hills at the beginning and middle of the ride. The ride also has a very highly acclaimed night ride, which I sadly have not experienced yet, but I'm sure it's fantastic with its very secluded, wooded setting that ventures far outside the park. At number 4 is the park's B&M inverted coaster, Banshee, that opened in 2014. This ride is absolutely massive for an inverted coaster and boasts 7 intense inversions throughout its long layout. My favorite elements on the ride would easily be the first drop, which doesn't feature a pre-drop like most inverts and goes straight into a fun dive loop, as well as the ride's final Heartline roll, which gives fantastic hang time and differentiates it from the rest of the ride's intense inversions. The ride does have a pretty serious rattle, however, especially towards the back of the train on the edge seats, so I would suggest sitting towards the front or at least in the middle 2 seats during your ride. The ride's vest restraints are also pretty restrictive and don't allow for much movement on your seat during the ride experience. It is still a very fun ride though, but the other B&Ms at the park are clearly better in my opinion. At number 3 is the park's GCI wooden coaster, Mystic Timbers, which opened in 2017. This ride is very highly acclaimed for its aggressive nature and ejector airtime moments, and I wouldn't disagree. The ride is also glass smooth for a wooden coaster and has some really solid pops of airtime throughout the ride and really maintains its speed very well too. The shed at the end of the ride was probably overhyped initially, but it definitely beats out sitting in the sun waiting for the train to move like some other coasters in the park. This ride is really fantastic and still my favorite wooden coaster that I've been on, but there are still 2 more coasters in the park that I think are better. At number 2 is the park's biggest and newest coaster, Orion, a B&M Giga coaster that opened in 2020. This was my first and still my only Giga coaster I've ridden, and it really is fantastic. The first drop is absolutely breathtaking and gives fantastic sustained airtime all the way down, especially with the ride's clamshell restraints. The ride also features some other great airtime moments such as the amazing speed hill and has an intense helix towards the end of the ride. The ride also looks amazing from the midway and is probably one of the most photogenic coasters I have seen. The ride is pretty short for a ride of its size, but it is still longer than Mystic Timbers surprisingly, and also has some fantastic theming throughout the new land that accompanied the ride when it opened. This and my number 1 are really close to each other, and both of my top 5, making them probably the best top 2 at a park I have visited so far. And at number 1 is the park's B&M Hypercoaster Diamondback that opened in 2009. This was the first major coaster Cedar Fair invested into Kings Island, and they knocked it out of the park. This ride has so much sustained airtime throughout the entire ride, it's almost unbelievable the first time you ride it. It also has a fantastic ride duration at over 70 seconds long, and has airtime throughout the entire layout. The splashdown effect at the end is also a really photogenic moment, and one of my favorite things to take pictures of when I visit the park. The ride just has the most airtime in the park, and while it doesn't have much else to offer, airtime is easily my favorite element on a coaster, and Diamondback certainly delivers on that front. Do you agree with Diamondback being the best at Kings Island, or do you think it's overhyped? Post your thoughts in the comment section below. Be sure to subscribe for more content, and check out my reviews of the coasters at Kings Island.